So before we do any presentation at Royal Roads, we always acknowledge that we are in the traditional lands of the Kosepsum and the Kwangin ancestors and families. And learning has been happening on the land of Royal Roads for countless generations. I also want to take a minute to acknowledge that we are in, of course, this really complex time right now. And, I think this topic really spoke to a lot of people, trying to communicate in a really polarized environment, whether that be around the topic of climate change or politics or anything. I think we really are all collectively trying to find a way to talk to each other in a more open way. So I'm so grateful for everyone who's joining and who's having similar thoughts. We really look forward to hearing your comments and your thoughts as we move through this presentation. And this really marks what we're about at Royal Roads. We are about finding a new way forward, building a future collectively, and co-creating what this new reality can look like. So with that, we're going to dive right into the presentation. Geo, we can, there we go. So I am going to introduce our host, Geo Takach, who is a professor and program head within the School of Communication and Culture. So I'll let you take it away, Geo.
Thank you very much, Alana. And with me is my indispensable partner in crime, the brilliant Kyera Cook, who is a graduate of the Master of Arts in Environmental Education and Communication program here at Royal Roads. And I want to acknowledge and thank the Kosepsum and Lekwungen territories and the wonderful ones and zeros that are bringing us all together today. There's so many critical environmental concerns facing us these days as communicators, as teachers, as researchers, and as citizens. There's air pollution, water pollution, loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, deforestation, the over-extraction of natural resources, the depletion of the ozone layer, overproduction of waste, to name just two. But it's climate change that's seen as our greatest existential threat and which grabs the most headlines. And I think it's probably because it's the easiest topic to warm up to. So this preliminary study explores how we talk about climate, and specifically climate change in public conversation or discourse. So what are we going to do today? I will provide some context for our study because context, it's what university folks do. We'll talk about framing and why it matters, and then we'll look at the study Framing Climate in Canadian News Media. I'll provide some context on the media landscape because, well, and Kyera will take you through our research methods and a working model that we've developed or we're developing to try to make some sense of climate conversations in the Canadian news media today. And then finally, because we are a practical applied research university, we'll look at some practical implications of this. What does this mean for professional communicators, and how can we address some of the challenges out there about communicating on climate today? So let's start with some context on this changing climate of ours. Now, Kyera and I are not scientists. However, we do like them, and more importantly, we do pay attention to what they tell us. And they tell us that climate change is attributed largely to increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which are produced significantly by the burning of fossil fuels, which of course traps heat radiating upward from the earth. And these concentrations are measured in parts per million of carbon per air particle. So here are a couple of examples of how scientists have been communicating this to us. They tell us that since the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide levels have risen 45%, but even more impressive than that statistic is this graph, which tells us that over the last 20 years, emissions have risen over 100-fold, and this past May hit a new record, 417 parts per million, which scientists estimate as at the highest levels it has ever been in the 23 million year history of the carbon-3 photosynthesis cycle. And if you followed the recent US election at all, you'll know that 23 million years is even longer than that. You may not know that. Let's look at climate. Let's talk climate, or more precisely, let's talk about talking about climate. And Canadians do want to talk about climate because during the first, here's an example, during the first 2 pre-pandemic months of this horrid year, Annus Horribilis 2020, Canadians declared the environment their most important concern. In August, a study out of the University of Ottawa set out on a 10-point scale, 45% of the respondents said the pandemic was a good to best time to address climate change. 29% said it was the bad to worst time. And in quintessential Canadian fashion, 26% wound up in the middle. So let's follow that leading edge 45% and start with 3 key premises. First, climate change, say the scholars, is a culturally constructed social phenomenon. What does that mean? Well, it means not only do we need to understand those graphs, understand the actual physical, hard meteorological data, but we also need to understand how that data is understood and how it is communicated. So which brings us to our second premise, speaking as a communicator, of course, we know language matters. Psychologists, cognitive and affective neuroscientists suggest that the emotions we feel, happiness, anxiety, rage, they're triggered or constructed in the moment, not biologically hardwired into our brains, and that the language we use actually constructs and shapes the emotions that we feel. So, in the words of Jan Suselbeck at the University of Calgary, go Dinos, this is why language matters. Changing words that we use can make an emotion actually appear or vanish. To this, the media, the Toronto Star in this instance, adds that 2019 witnessed the emergence of a public discourse dominated by the language of climate change or climate emergency. And in the end, words do matter. So climate was included in the word of the year that Collins and Oxford dictionaries celebrated in 2019. So what is a word of the year? Oxford defines its word of the year as a word or expression shown through usage evidence to reflect the ethos, mood, or preoccupations of the passing year and have lasting potential as a term of cultural significance. Oxford noted a 100-fold increase in the use of climate emergency in 2019. So they said that, what you see on your screen, to which they added, this year, heightened public awareness of climate science and the myriad implications around the world has generated enormous discussion of what the United Nations Secretary General has called the defining issue of our time. Public conversations, we know from the literature, can be shaped in part by the information available. So where do we look for that? Well, we look to the media landscape, which brings us to our third premise, and that is level 2 agenda setting theory, which is a theory from communication studies that tells us that the media shapes not only what we think about, which is level 1 agenda setting, but also what we think about it, and most importantly, what we do about it. So it's not dictating, but certainly shaping and informing and influencing. Which brings us to a pivotal moment in the discourse on climate, which actually inspired this study. And that's in May of last year, The Guardian updated its media style guide. And it pronounced that we're now going to prefer terms like climate crisis and global heating to merely climate change, because these new terms are more accurate descriptors of the current state of the Earth's condition than climate change. Here's The Guardian's editor-in-chief, Catherine Viner, without the accent, quote, "We want to ensure that we are being scientifically precise while also communicating clearly with readers on this very important issue. The phrase climate change, for example, sounds rather passive and gentle when what scientists are talking about is a catastrophe for humanity. The Guardian was followed closely by the Spanish news agency, EFE, and then by CNN and NPR stateside and many other popular media acronyms. So, a generation ago, Supertramp asked, crisis? What crisis? What do we mean by crisis when we're talking about a climate crisis? Well, let's go to our friends at Oxford, since they seem to enjoy this topic. They define a crisis as a time of great danger, difficulty, or doubt, when problems must be solved or important decisions must be made. So my takeaway from this is that crisis means a tipping point requiring at which urgent action is required. Now, the Guardian's move, its decree, precipitated widespread debates over the role and the objectivity of the news media when it comes to communicating about the environment. CBC's initial response, it has since altered its framework, but its initial response was to express caution over what it called the whiff of advocacy in the term climate crisis. And it felt as a public broadcaster that its objectivity would be impaired by using a term like climate crisis in its news coverage. So what do? We step back to the literature and we see that cultural theories of social science can help us understand environmental communication by showing that communication processes are not specific to any one subject. Rather, they follow some inherent rules. So for environmental communicators and scholars, our use of the term climate presents, two things. First, an instructive case study on the importance of framing in public discourse, and second, an environmental, social, and economic catastrophe. It presents that too. So what is framing then? Well, we start with the classic formulation of framing as selecting or emphasizing one aspect of something over other aspects of it. Peters et al. Frames are a means through which people attempt to understand unfamiliar and complex concepts through their own experiences and predispositions. You can't avoid framing. It's how we orient our thinking. It's how we make sense of the world. Example, Royal Roads University, okay? How do we see that? Through what lens or frame do we see Royal Roads? Well, for those of us privileged to be there, to work there, it's a place of applied, authentic, caring, community-based, and transformational learning. For its creator, the government of British Columbia, Royal Roads is one of 6 designated research universities in the great province of British Columbia. But depending on your point of view, it's also a castle, an ivory tower, a community hub, on the déclassé side of the Tweed Curtain, way west of Oak Bay. It's a national historic park. It's an oasis of breathtaking vistas of water and forest and mountains. Or it's part of a colonialist structure that continues to steal Indigenous land and erase Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Sidebar, with great help from the Wilson Report, we're working on it. Climate change has been called a super wicked problem, characterized by 4 things: uncertain consequences, we don't know exactly when, what's going to happen; multiple and diverse engaged interests; conflicting knowledges; and high stakes. Now, because framing, by definition, requires different perspectives, and perspectives can differ, it also involves power relations. And these are exercised through the choices we make, choices that favor the interests of some over the interests of others. This is a critical theory orientation to this study. So we ask, why does framing matter in environmental communication? Well, it matters because framing the climate teaches us and helps us do things. That's called pragmatic. But it also shapes our attitudes and our actions, which is called constitutive. So communicators can choose which aspects of climate change to emphasize or downplay. Framing is not a neutral exercise. For example, frames of climate change can emphasize its economic costs or benefits. They can heighten partisan or ideological or political conflict. They can stress or downplay scientific consensus. Framing climate change can be political, focusing on the role of the nation, making it a real partisan issue. It can be economic, as I mentioned. It can be environmental, focusing on the effects of ecological systems and their residents. It can be humanitarian, appealing to global solidarity and responsibility. Now, we know that advertisers' use of frames can actually cause audiences to favor or delay or omit altogether taking up pro-environmental behaviors. So really, any way you heat it, the use of climate frames is rising, and the literature is pretty clear on that. And the news media still play a central role because they're still a main source of information for most citizens. Representation in the news media has been shown time and time again to be integral when it comes to defining social problems and which ones we address and how quickly and to what extent we address them. And our study and others show that crisis is being used increasingly in the news media. So here's some bellwether stuff. A study from News Media Canada, which is, it must be noted, is the voice of the print and digital media industry in this country, found that newspaper readership was at an all-time high last year. Quelle surprise, at least it was to me. Apparently 88% of millennials, according to this study, read the newspaper on a weekly basis, primarily on their phones. 90% of baby boomers do that, largely in print, and 93% of what the study called business decision makers read it in any form they can get it, possibly through intravenous tubes. Let's look at two bellwether publications here from our research. The first is the Globe and Mail, Toronto Globe and Mail to some of us, founded in the year 1884 and called in enough places to mention Canada's newspaper of record, a newspaper of significance. And in counterpoint, we use the National Observer, founded in 2015, very, very active in its coverage on climate and recognized for that, and purporting in its own words to have driven the national conversation on energy and climate change. This will give you an idea of references to articles in those publications mentioning the term climate change since the Observer started anyway in 2015. Interestingly enough, this year, just 2 months ago, the Globe and Mail felt the need to make this pronouncement: we are renewing our pledge to cover the climate crisis. Now, this huge jump in coverage you'll notice on the graph started in the first half of 2019, which, as you may recall, is pretty much when The Guardian changed its style guide. Now, we don't know whether The Guardian's move was the cause of this or merely an echo of the zeitgeist of the time. This is what communication scholars would say: well, we need more research so we can actually determine the media effects and determine the extent to which agenda setting theory operates here. Now, in a true sign of the times, the phrase climate crisis graced the October 2019 cover of the Canadian print edition of Reader's Digest magazine, which I frame here affectionately as that supermarket staple, perhaps the ultimate mainstream publication. Sidebar, fun fact, the corresponding American edition did not have the term climate change on the cover. This was unique to the Canadian edition of the publication. Different nations frame climate change in different ways, in fact. It's been found by studies to be more politicized in Western nations, possibly because of the prevailing media norms of balance. And I would use that in air quotes but as people who know me know, there's been a restraining order placed on me, and I'm very limited in the number of air quotes I can use in any given year. And perhaps that should be more widespread, perhaps not. Less wealthy nations, it has been shown, look on this as a global problem and frame climate more in terms of its environmental effects or economic effects, especially where they're more severe, as in, for example, the Philippines or Gambia. So at this point, it is my distinct honor and delight to turn you over to Kyera for a discussion of our research methods and our model. Take it, Kyera.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Geo. So thanks for that great introduction. I'm going to jump into what we were working on for our research methods. So we actually had two stages so far. We've had two stages for our research. We conducted this research beginning back in May of this year. And I started searching for articles dated beginning in January of 2019. So we were really looking to get some coverage around that article that came out in May. And then more recently, we've done an update to the research with articles from the past 6 months. So for both parts of the research, I began with just a general search using the term climate in the Canadian Periodical Index, Nexus Uni, Google News, trying to get a good variety of different sources, different publications. And then I also paired that term with change, crisis, and emergency. So climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency. And so from there, we got a good stack of articles and have developed the model. And then up next, what we hope to do with the research is we're hoping to gain an understanding of journalists' perspectives on the framing of climate. So we're hoping to do some interviews and some surveys with journalists working in Canadian news media and see what if they support our findings or if they give us something completely different. And then we'll be sharing this research. If any of you are familiar with Geo, you'll know that he's really skilled at creating eco-comedy podcasts, really engaging dialogue. So you might be able to look forward to something like that coming out of our research in terms of a way to share it. So upon collecting all the media, I began noting that depending on the source, articles seem to diverge into one of two frames. So I started noticing pretty early on a polarizing conversation between either climate responsibility is a collective concern or climate responsibility falls on the individual. So that was kind of one split in terms of where the conversation was going, where the framing was going. And then another polarizing conversation that I started to notice in the articles was that either the frame was that climate issues demand mitigation, so advocating for proactive steps now, or that climate issues will require adaptation, so that's advocating for reactive responses. That was another way that, that the articles were framing the climate crisis. So based on the observations, I started to situate each of the terms based on their framing and created this working model. So I say working model because it does continue to evolve, as Geo mentioned. This is actually the second version of our model. We started the first one back in May, and it's been really interesting to see how it has evolved up to this point. So I've done some updates and some adjustments to reflect the changes in the conversation that have happened in the past 6 months. So I just want to put a note out in order to help understand this model. Now, this model is looking at the framing. So it's not necessarily how each term is associated with mitigation or collectivism, but it's helping to understand how the audiences may have been primed in their perspective when they read or hear these particular terms. So if we start at the beginning, I'm going to give a bit of a description of how each of these terms came to be and what they represent in terms of framing. So if we start where all of the research began, with climate crisis at the top there, the use of this term shows up in communication for the urgent need for people to act to mitigate climate change. So this perspective accepts global heating as a fact. It acknowledges the grave human contribution, and it recommends large-scale, immediate, and permanent fixes. So recently, the media has compared actions taken against the climate crisis to those for COVID-19 or in times of war, and is arguing that the approach should be equally as uncompromising. And some additional terms that have come up, the media is pointing to the psychological impacts of a climate crisis, noting conditions such as climate anxiety or climate grief. So just to give an example, one of the headlines that came up in my media audit, the title is "A New Book Calls on Canadians to Mobilize for the Climate Crisis Like World War II." So that's kind of something creating the conversation there, and that was from Maclean's magazine. And additionally to the term climate crisis, you might find some other terms that are used as well, or you're used in place of climate crisis. So those terms might be climate emergency, climate anxiety, or if you see the terms that The Guardian is changing their language on, they're recommending, when referring to the science of climate change, instead of saying climate change, they're now using climate breakdown. So climate breakdown might also be a term that you'll see alongside climate crisis. And then if we jump to the other side of that axis, so looking down at the bottom, how the adaptation framing is coming up in the conversation with climate debate. So I've noticed in the media throughout different conversations that a climate debate has seemed to have transitioned through three different phases. So initially it was the scientific denial of climate change, and then transitioned into the anthropogenic contributions, so are humans to blame for climate change? And now we've transitioned into what is being called the new climate denialism. So this is where there's a verbal acceptance of the climate crisis, but it's followed by a debate on what to do about it, how to implement policy, or could be that there's tokenistic commitment, but no actual change that people are seeing. So this perspective is generally in opposition to any notion of urgency, and it's sometimes set into agenda-focused communication. So portraying anyone seeking environmental justice as someone who might also have an alarmist scheme and have a threat to the national economy or to national safety. So we're seeing terms like the new climate denial, climate alarmism, and climate agenda are coming up alongside or instead of the climate debate. And then a particularly striking headline that came up kind of explaining this term, the framing of this term, was in January of this year from the Financial Post. And they say, after deliberately turning itself into a climate change martyr, Canada needs some basic common sense. So that's the headline for that one. And then if we want to take a look at the other axis that I've seen the polarized conversation on, is we can look at collectivism. So climate policy here, the framing of climate policy centers around the idea that the climate crisis is a super wicked problem that doesn't respect any geopolitical boundary. It addresses multi-level government regulation to include programs, incentives, legislation, tax, investment. And proponents of this frame generally bring up the importance of voting and the importance of international collaboration. So a headline that came up here in the media is from a smaller newspaper publication, the Rosslyn Telegraph. And they're saying carbon pricing in the climate crisis is like hand washing in a pandemic. And then some terms that you might see alongside or in place of climate policy are going to be climate tax, climate regulation, climate commitment. among some others. And on the opposite end of the axis, we're going to jump over to individualism. So here we're finding climate economy seems to be the center of this discussion. This term centers climate issues around the industry and employment risks of climate change. It also looks at the economic opportunities of climate change, and it advocates for siloed and individual enforcement of legislation. Proponents of this term communicate that companies are responsible for their own actions, their own climate actions, and that global or international regulation is not the solution. So title here, communicating this frame, the Toronto Star is saying, the Canada Pension Plan invests with sustainability in mind, but it should be driven by maximizing returns and not politics. So as well as climate economy, you might see something like climate capitalism, climate liability, climate polarization. And then moving on to some of the intersecting points. So if we look at where the mitigation frame is meeting with the collectivism frame, I started to pick up on the framing of a climate revolution. So this points to capitalism, colonialism, and racism as the root causes of climate change and urges for a complete systemic transformation. So a couple of headlines here that are communicating this perspective. The Guardian is saying, we've had so many wins and why the green movement can overcome climate crisis. Or from the Tyee saying, normal is the problem. And similarly here, you might see something like climate justice, climate rebellion, and then also talking about the climate future. And then in our intersecting points between collectivism and adaptation, I saw a lot of conversation centered around climate resilience. So this frame comes from communicators who have noticed that communities are already experiencing impacts of climate change, and they're recommending to plan to create more resilient systems in order to withstand threats of climate change. So while this term resilience has developed a community and a collective framing, it is often paired with adaptation and rarely mitigation. So for example, here we have Global News saying Manitoba invests $15 million in climate resiliency projects in and around Winnipeg. So you might see, as well as that, you might see a climate plan, climate training, climate refugia. And refugia refers to conserving areas that are already resilient to climate change. And then the intersecting point between adaptation and individualism, we're going to find climate transition here. And so this term I have found has been used in a frame that is communicating that there is abundant wealth and bounty that exists in Canada's natural resources. So in order to address climate issues, industries should continue extraction and then leverage economic gain to later transition to renewables and sustainable energy. The proponents of a climate transition argue the best way forward is to harness the power of capitalist growth. So communicating a transition, we find the CBC has a title of an article saying, freeze carbon tax, delay new climate regulations during coronavirus crisis, the oil lobby asks. So as well as transition, you might see something like climate strategies, climate development, climate ingenuity. And then finally, we have the unique intersection of individualism and mitigation. And I've found here that this term encompasses the focus that media places on individual responsibility in the climate crisis without questioning business as usual or the societal systems which created climate issues. So those using this term often communicate that personal behavioral change of small daily habits through green consumerism is the solution to the climate issue. So one particularly striking headline, my personal favorite in terms of the the striking component. The CTV, put out an article saying Burger King addresses climate change by changing cows' diets. So that's kind of representing where the climate footprint and framing is coming from. But we find here that as well, the other side of the argument is represented. So the CBC put out an article saying why your reduced carbon footprint from lockdown won't slow climate change. So we're seeing both sides of the conversation there. And then as well as footprint, you might find climate-friendly behaviors, you might find climate consciousness or climate sustainability.
Okay, Kyera, thank you very much. That's the model as it sits this afternoon. Tomorrow morning, it might be something a little different. It continues to evolve, and we'll certainly be testing it when we're engaging with journalists one-on-one in interviews, and then hopefully on a bit supplemented on a larger scale quantitatively with the survey. So at the end of the day, though, what does what we found mean? How can we're an applied university at Royal Roads. We want to look at how this can help, this preliminary model can, and our findings can help communicators in practice. So what we'd like to present to you now is a problem solution model where on the one hand, we're going to present challenges identified for climate communicators, and we're going to follow that with responses, things that we can do suggested by our review of the news media articles, of the scholarly literature, and journalistic practice and experience. So we got 10 of these. How's our time? We'll whistle through them for you here. The first challenge is the argument you get that, well, you know, change, that revolution that Kyera was talking about, that's going to hurt the economy. Okay, here's the response. So challenge response. Agreed, yes, but it would hurt primarily the carbon-based economy. And things to emphasize are that GDP and economic growth, as important as they are not the only measure of progress and success in society. Health and well-being might come up somewhere too. Bhutan provides a great example in that regard of gross national happiness. And we can also note that it might be harmful to put economic prosperity ahead of planetary and human survival, which is what this economic frame is doing. Here's another critique, that climate communication is confusing. I mean, look at the Paris Agreement. Holding increases in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit future temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Yes, it is complicated. So what we want to do is see clarity, consistency, and transparency in our communication, and stress that it's a societal issue, not only a scientific issue, not that there's anything wrong with that. We also want to relate it to actual local concerns. Examples, flooding coastal communities, devastation of forests by the pine beetle, drought plaguing the prairies. We can use a problem solution framework, again, as I'm trying to do here, provide actual actions or suggestions that people can take in our communications. And as any good communicator can tell you, personalize your message to the audience. What about this attack? You know, well, you know, there are a lot of jet-setting superstars and public figures and media figures and influencers riding around the world in their fancy planes. Why should we believe what they have to say? Okay, as communicators, what's our response? Well, we want to use diverse and credible and convincing champions that will appeal to specific audiences for those specific audiences. And we want also to note scientific consensus. There is one, and engage scientists to counter this frame of political conflict that we're seeing. But mostly, I think we want to stay focused on the issue, keep our eyes on the prize, and avoid ad hominem attacks, avoid attacking the messenger, stay focused on the issue. When Greta Thunberg came to Alberta, there were ad hominem attacks and cartoons and other unflattering things that were directed at her personally rather than at the issue. It's a classic detracting strategy. Here's another lament. There's no empathy in your communication when you refer to people as deniers or doubters. So the advice on that is not to lambaste or ridicule your opponents. Rather research where the audience comes from and acknowledge their concerns and their fears and where they come from. And most importantly, appeal to shared values and to local common threats. Which brings us to this, lack of imminent threat. Climate change takes place over deep time. Well, if you'll recall those couple of graphs we looked at earlier on, not anymore. We need to move the discourse to catch up to the science. We need to move the discourse to real time with metaphors of accelerating slow death. This change in climate, this crisis is happening right now. So what we can do in our communications is to highlight personally relevant and near-term effects. For example, one of my favorite places on Earth is a spit of land called Ocean Boulevard, which is a roadway, a small roadway separated by rock and beach on either side, separating the Esquimalt Lagoon, which is where what Royal Roads overlooks, from water, the Strait of Juan de Fuca. By the modeling is telling us that by the end of this century, it will be completely flooded over. That spit of land will be gone, and the ocean will meet the lagoon and start heading up the hill to the castle. So the other piece of advice we get on the time thing is to treat climate change or crisis like an infectious disease. So, consider what the experts have to say, much as we would consider what the experts on COVID-19 might say. And here's where Kyera's war mobilization analogy, which Bill McKibben has also adopted, comes into play. Here's another one. It's too big a problem. There's nothing I can do. Well, that is understandable, isn't it? It's overwhelming, can be distressing. We've heard that climate grief is a thing and a frame that we are seeing. But we need to remind people as communicators that business as usual is not an option, that we need a multi-front approach, starting with the personal through to the local to the global. So first of all, cite everyday acts of individual environmental responsibility. Organize the community. I was particularly inspired by this group that called themselves the Sustainabiliteens. The 3 high school activists, 17 years old at the time in Vancouver, they organized a climate strike, which became one of the largest mass mobilizations ever to take place in Vancouver, drawing over 100,000 people last year. And finally, on the biggest level, we want to work to change policy, advocate for policy and for change on a large scale, because guess what? The existing systems and the factors that created them, colonization of the environment, much as we have colonized indigenous people and others, is the cause and needs to be addressed. Here is possibly, Kyera had a favorite. This might be my favorite when it comes to arguments. It's an intrusion on my individual freedom. Yes. We can emphasize that we have a responsibility, perhaps even greater than our individual freedoms, to all humans in life, all of which are at risk here. And we can raise the issue of climate justice and morality and the golden rule, which is actually common to many, if not all, of the world's large religions. And certainly most belief systems, the notion that to treat people the way we would want them to treat us. And it's also important to caution not to be blindfolded by the neoliberal imperative that the free market rules everything. It is the master, and I use that gendered term advisedly, of all things, and all things must yield to the market. What people who make this argument are actually telling us is this: Government involvement is wrong. So any kind of rules or regulations to avert, in this case, climate crisis, well, they're wrong too, and we just shouldn't do it. And I think we can challenge that a bit and try to dig out its roots and expose it for what is actually going on. And that's what we as communicators and we as teachers at Royal Roads try to do. This notion that this is a political issue, well, it's certainly become one, but there's a problem when you detach the dialogue and the conflict from the actual planetary and existential threat to everything that climate crisis presents. And it's a problem when you distract from that by getting into things like cost-benefit analyses and scenarios of us against them. This is boundary thinking or framing, when really what we need is the total opposite. We need unity thinking. And I think we have to stress that this is a nonpartisan issue. The eminent and beloved scientist Catherine Hayhoe says, a thermometer is neither liberal nor conservative. And I got a startling reminder of this. Thank you, Nigel, from a political legend who said this, quote, if we've learned any lessons during the past few decades, perhaps the most important is that preservation of our environment is not a partisan challenge, it is common sense. So this does not come from Annemie Paul, it doesn't come from the BC Greens today, but it actually comes from 36 years ago from a former American president named Ronald Reagan, who's a Republican, either venerated or despised as the father of that neoliberalism thing I mentioned earlier, him and Margaret Thatcher. So we get into this notion then, number 9, of alarmism. You know, that this is Chicken Little stuff, you know, it's not that bad. Well, you know, I say to you 3 things. First, look at the science, look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Look at the political reality. The fact is 1,830 jurisdictions scattered across 31 nations, representing 820 million citizens, have declared, passed declarations, declaring, that's redundant, sorry, passed declarations stating that this is in fact a climate emergency, Canada being one of them. Followed shortly by their purchasing a pipeline, but that's another story. Finally, look at Martin Luther King back in 1963, quote, this is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. This time I want to give a shout out to our retired colleague, one of my heroes, Michael Reel, who was actually there. Hi, Michael. Also, be careful with this whole alarmism thing, which I'll touch on in just a moment. And finally, the notion that Kyera mentioned, this new climate denialism, where people are now paying lip service to climate change, but really doing not enough or nothing to address the crisis. And the advice there is, well, practice accountability in your own communications and demand it from everyone else too. So at the end of the day then, what does all this mean? Well, what this research in progress shows, it shows support for findings that the discourse around climate is shifting, and that climate is rising in the news media discourse in both quantity of news articles and the extent to which it is framed as a crisis. As Kyera noted, we've seen an emphatic shift in even the last 6 months around things like revolution. There's an increasing demand for systemic change. The notion of resilience, that initially it was a bit of a cop-out. The planet's resilient, it'll take care of it. We're now shifting to humans being resilient and adapting in addition to mitigating. And I noticed one of you raised that in the chat box, so I'll try to speak to that before I'm done, which will be soon. And again, this notion of denialism. The 3 stages of denialism that we've seen, it's, I think, pretty important. Not really debating in the popular media much about whether there is climate crisis, We're not really debating whether people caused it. We're now debating how much and what we should do about it, which I guess on one hand is pretty optimistic. So we're seeing these themes emerge in this shift: not returning to business as usual, movement, mobilization, radical spending, innovation, reconciliation. So in our working model, I think the two axes that Kyera outlined offer ways to make sense of the diverse frames being deployed in this discourse on climate crisis. The notion of mitigation and adaptation. And the UN has been very clear on this. We actually do need both. And collectivist and individualist. Again, we do need both. And mitigation, as one of the comments in the chat box pointed out, could also be diluted to something passive or reactive. I think that's a very good point. So we have to be careful in ensuring that our mitigation is as proactive as possible. And the same thing too with adaptation, which in the one hand, if you look at adaptation to a minimal enough degree, it gets downgraded to business as usual. So I think the key here has to be action. And so the bottom line for action and communication to inspire it, I think we can quote Rebecca Hamilton, one of those three sustainabilities, who challenged us by asking, is what we are doing, is what we are saying, in alignment with the recognition that we're living in a climate crisis? Now, a danger, final word, a danger of using a term like crisis, that alarmist argument, is that it can become commonplace and risk losing its power, the power to inspire thought and concern and action. But if we don't frame the state of climate change as the emergency that credible sources like the IPCC and Kyera declare that it is, then history teaches us that we are less likely to act. So ultimately, whether we say anything, what we talk about, what we say, how we say it, all of these have consequences. And climate change, whether we frame it as a crisis or otherwise, gives anyone who wants to say or do anything about it what just might be our most crucial and daunting challenge yet. I want to give a shout out to these three and turn it back to Alana. Over to you for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Geo and Kyera. Like such important research you guys are doing, and taking the time to take all of us through it. I know I'm so appreciative, and I'm so appreciative to everyone who's in this room. And if you haven't looked through the chat box, I really encourage everyone to. There's been a ton of resources shared. We obviously have some very very educated on the topic folks in the room who have happily shared their resources. So thank you all for that. Of course, there's never enough time for these conversations. There's such big conversations. So we don't have a ton of time to go into questions, but I do want to make sure that we can get to at least a few of them. So if there's something that you can really see that's pithy in this whole discussion that you can frame to us, and you're welcome to put it in the chat box, and you are welcome to also raise your hand and turn on your mic and ask a question. But if there's something in you that's burning, I would love to hear it. And I'm just going to give you guys a moment, because there is one that I saw in the chat box that I thought that I would just speak to, because it's something that really comes up for me. And I figure if it comes up for me, it's probably coming up for a lot of other people. And there was a point in the discussion where you talked a lot about the anxiety and paralysis that can be evoked by the communication that's used to describe this topic. And the question was, how can we frame this topic in a way that provokes action? And I'm wondering if there's a few words that either of you can, from your research, that can speak to that. Is there anything that's shown up in terms of how people talk about this that seems to have a little bit more of a provoking sort of effect?
Kyera, what do you say? Any thoughts?
Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. That's a great question, and that was something that the climate anxiety was something that Geo brought up with me this week, actually, because we were kind of playing with where it would fit on the model, if it needed its whole own separate section, because it's definitely something that people are speaking to more recently, and that climate anxiety, the climate grief, and even this term solastalgia is coming up, which refers to the nostalgia or the longing or the sadness for a place that doesn't exist anymore. So these three terms are, really something that's coming up in the media. And in terms of addressing that for action, from what I've personally found compelling is when people take an empathetic approach. It's so rare that you'll find, in all of this research, I found the one article that's saying, the environmental movement is one of the most successful movements of our time. And I saw that written once, right? But that empathy, that compassion, I think personally is what I've found to be the most compelling in terms of inspiring action. And I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Geo.
Always. Thanks, Kyera. It is a great question, and I think it's important to acknowledge. It's important to acknowledge and even to foreground that grief, which is not to make the whole discourse a wailing session. However, I think to deny grief is to deny our humanity and to deny the power of emotion in communication. Because when you communicate in parts per million, my goodness, that science is the bedrock. It's where we have to, any discussion has to start. However, logic is only part of the human condition. Emotion is another part of it. And study after study shows that when people make decisions, they like to have a good, solid, logical case to hang it on, but emotion is really what tends to push people over. So I see both of them as strong and not mutually exclusive forces to buttress the climate communicators toolkit. Don't shy away from the grief. Acknowledge it, address it. Maybe it will motivate more people to take some action and to realize that other people share their grief. If we run away in our closets, bury ourselves in cookies and blankets and cry a lot, and it is sorely tempting to do that on any given day, then we've lost. And this is a battle we can't lose, and Mother Nature can't afford to lose either.
Thank you for both of your insight on that. I love that piece of empathy, just in terms of, empathy for each other and what the experience is, but also that empathetic piece of actually finding ways to communicate so that people can rebuild the relationship with the land that they're on, or a certain memory of nature or whatever. That just that really spoke to me. So thank you so much for that. I see that Pumpkin has a follow-up question. I'm thinking maybe you would like to speak to that. If you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to. I've given everybody the power to unmute themselves. So if you want to ask a question, you're
Hello.
Hello.
So one of the main issues, obviously, and are what, now that we have spoken and you've spoken to how we can communicate more clearly in the different steps of how to get there, if you had yourself had the power of, say, I don't know, the next US president in a country that really needs desperately some guidance, what is the first step of business or conversation that you would that you would push forward to create some much needed environmental change?
Wow. Well, thank you, Pumpkin. That's certainly food for thought. Kyera, do you want to start?
That's a great question. I don't think I would ever want to be the president of the United States. But anyways, I think all of those 10 points that Geo listed in the practical implications, kind of shifting the conversation on any of those pieces. I mean, to me, I kind of see them all as equally important. I'm not sure, Geo, if you see that one is particularly more important than the other.
Well, that's a good note, Kyera. No, it's like they're all trying to plug leaks, and if you ignore one of them, you know, the water's coming through. And I think if I had to sum it all of that up in one thing, it would just be the fact that as the climate is changing, so must we change in our everyday lives, in our families, in our communities, and in these artificial constructs, colonialist constructs they call nations, and as a global community, we really have to come together to change, because this isn't working, and change is unsettling. It can be daunting. It can be deeply, deeply frightening and distressing, and that's where a lot of those 10 things come from. You can see the fear, the unspoken, again, hiding the emotion, the unspoken fear behind some of these things. People like the comfort of the familiar. They like things the way they are because they know them, and to some extent they've been able to navigate or negotiate them. But really the systems, time and time again, we're being told to an increasingly dramatic extent by the science, and now in the discourse, we're being told that it just is not sustainable. It has to change, and it has to start with us. We're out of time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pumpkin. I did have another question around, and Geo, I'll let me know if this is possible, but I just want to put it out there. But there was a couple of requests about looking at more information regarding data sources and methodologies in terms of this research, and I'm wondering if that's something that is or will be available for more public distribution at some point if people are interested.
Oh, wonderful question. You know, when people in universities hear questions like that, they want to do little happy dances as soon as the cameras are off, because it's just too punishing otherwise. Emphatically, yes. Kyera mentioned some of the ways we're going to be sharing this work, and it's going to be through arts-based means, but we also honor the traditionalist side of the Academy. We will be hoping to publish it in scholarly form, where you can read in lurid detail what our methodology is and the methods within that methodology, like why we did what we did and how we did it. But also in this popular and alt news media, we also are going to reach out to there, recognizing that more than the 6 people who read scholarly articles might be interested in this research. So that's going to be our 3-pronged attack for sharing out how we do what we do, as well as why and what we find. The scholarly literature, the popular and alt literature, and then the arts-based means, whether it's some form of online theater or otherwise, coming soon to a screen near you, we hope.
Great. So for those who were looking for that information, you can email me directly, and I'll make sure to let Geo know so he can let you know when that article is published and ready for public distribution. I think we are, just a bit after 1 now, so I think I'm going to, just in the interest of everyone's time, wrap it up. It seems like the questions have been answered, and I want to thank everyone who joined, who participated in the chat, or just took in the information for food for thought. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I'm so grateful to be in a community of other people who are considering this topic and how we can navigate it. We do want to have a few shout outs because, we are Royal Roads University, and this really speaks, this kind of applied research, as Geo mentioned, does speak to to how we teach and how we try to apply what people are learning. So there's always opportunities for in fact, we love it. We're an Ashoka Changemaker campus, so we're all about people having opportunities to make real change in the world as they move through their programs. Kyera is actually one of our MA in Environmental Education and Communication graduates, so she really attests to that in terms of obviously how she's making impact with her degree. But we have a number, as you can see, of programs through the School of Communication and Culture, and as well as in the School of Environment and Sustainability. So if you are interested in any programs, there's quite a few in the School of Environment and Sustainability, so we didn't have room to list them all, unfortunately. But if you are interested, you're not already on our mailing list, please reach out to me. I'm happy to get you in touch. And I see we have some current students and some alumni in the room right now who are typing in. So thank you so much. And we also have a wonderful enrollment team. So if you are wanting more in-depth information or wanting to look into the application process, then we can get you in touch with them as well. Oh, there's so many students in here. That's great. Okay, well, with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And again, if you need any more information, I'm here. You should all have my email. I've sent you multiple emails inviting you and reminding you about the session. So please be in touch. And thank you so much, Geo and Kyera, for sharing this really important work with this community.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we hope we will connect with you all soon. Bye for now.